Hi, Peter.
Good to meet you.
Nice meeting you too. So I'm Alexa, your host. Welcome to the Debunque It podcast, and I'm happy to meet you. In today's episode, we bring to you a very special guest, someone who has constantly put their body on the line for human rights. And she has always been very vocal against the discrimination of the global LGBTQ plus community. British LGBTQ plus human rights activist, Peter Tatchell. I'm Alexa, your host, and this is the fourth episode of the Debunk It podcast. Peter, you're most welcome to the Debunk It podcast.
I'm very pleased to join you, and I'm full of admiration for the struggle you are waging for LGBT plus freedom in Uganda.
So, can you briefly talk about yourself and what you do?
Well, I was born in Melbourne, Australia in 1952. I began my activism in 1967 when I was 15 and still at school. Since then, I've been involved in over 3,000 direct action protests. I've been arrested or detained by the police more than 100 times. I've been subjected to more than 300 violent assaults, plus 50 attacks upon my home, including arson attacks and even a bullet through my front door. But I'm still here, I'm still campaigning, and I'm still supporting LGBTs worldwide who are struggling for liberation.
Thank you, Peter. I'll pop to my first question. How do you guarantee your safety on this as an activist?
When I began campaigning for LGBT plus rights in my homeland of Australia in the 1960s, there were no LGBT plus organizations at all in my hometown of Melbourne. No campaign groups, not even any helplines or switchboards. There was nothing. I was a lone campaigner. And it was quite scary because at that time, homosexuality was still punishable by several years imprisonment and even enforced psychiatric treatment. So all I could do at that period was really write letters to the press or members of parliament to make the case for decriminalization and to speak out against homophobia. But it was risky because the police used to go gay bashing as a sport. So if you got identified as being gay, there was a high chance the police could target you and not just arrest you, but also beat you. And they could get away with it. Now, for me, in all the years since, I've often challenged very powerful, very influential people like President Mugabe of Zimbabwe, the Zimbabwean dictator, like President George W. Bush, like Tony Blair, the British Prime Minister, and many, many others. And of course, sometimes that has involved considerable risks because these powerful people are surrounded by bodyguards. And I can remember when I tried my second citizen's arrest of President Mugabe in Brussels in 2001, I was beaten unconscious by his bodyguards. Now, of course, I never wanted that, but it was a very good thing to happen because people who saw the film footage said, if President Mugabe is prepared to beat up a peaceful protester in broad daylight in a European capital city in front of the world's media, just imagine what he's doing to his own people when no one is watching. So I've been left with a bit of brain and eye damage as a result, but nothing significant or major. Also, of course, I went to Moscow several times to support the brave Russian LGBT activists who tried to hold pride parades. And in 2007, I was very badly beaten, not unconscious, but almost lost consciousness by neo-Nazis with the connivance of the Moscow police and riot squad. Now, again, I never wanted that, but it did highlight the brutality and repression of the regime. So, yep, I've taken some risks, but to be honest, not as many risks as some people in Uganda, Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and many other dictatorships have taken. They've been much, much braver than me and taken many more risks. And some of them, of course, have paid with their lives. So I think of those who've died, who've been killed, who've been murdered by dictatorships, or by extremists and homophobes like David Kato in Uganda. I haven't suffered that fate. They paid with their lives, and their sacrifice, their courage inspires me to keep going.
Thank you, Peter. As you know, the situation in Uganda gets increasingly more terrifying for the LGBTQ community due to the law that was passed that increased persecution in Uganda. Actually, people here are isolated, so it feels like the international community has abandoned the LGBTQ plus individuals in Uganda. How aware is the international community of the situation in Uganda for queer and trans people?
I think the global LGBT plus community is very aware, very disturbed, very angry, and full of solidarity. But of course, there's not a lot that we can do. In terms of the wider society, there is some awareness. And I think it's good that international bodies like the World Bank are shining the spotlight on homophobia in Uganda. And they can do things. They have power to do things, as do Western governments. And one of the things that I've argued for in consultation with activists in developing countries where there is repression, I've said that foreign governments and institutions like the World Bank should switch aid from homophobic governments to NGOs that don't discriminate. So, for example, some years ago in Malawi, we persuaded the British government to switch its aid from the government of Malawi to local NGOs that did not discriminate against LGBT plus people. So that way, poor people in Malawi, or indeed poor people in Uganda today, can still get the aid they need, but it doesn't go to the governments. The governments are not rewarded for homophobia and dictatorship. And that's something I'm encouraging Western governments to do, to switch their aid from the government of Uganda to local NGOs and indeed international aid agencies that do not discriminate.
So, Peter, a simple question, yeah? You talked about helping other activists in other countries when actually maybe they have set up campaigns for the LGBTQ plus individuals. I'm just asking myself, why are you not yet in Uganda to help these young coming activists who are actually fighting for the LGBTQ plus community?
Well, we know that the struggle for LGBT plus rights is a global struggle. It knows no boundaries, no borders. It's not determined by culture or politics or belief or religion. It's a universal human right. So therefore, we have a duty to support, encourage, and amplify the voices of LGBT plus Ugandans and others in similar countries where they face the twin persecutions of not just homophobia, but dictatorship in general. And I'm sure you all know the struggle for LGBT plus rights in Uganda is part of a much broader struggle by civil society, because the Museveni regime is a dictatorship. There have been no free and fair elections for many, many years. The repression of civil society is not confined to LGBT plus people. It's across the board. And that's why I think it's so great that organizations like Sexual Minorities Uganda and others work in alliance with other civil society groups. So when the LGBT plus community is under attack, those other organizations rally to support the LGBT plus community. And then when trade unions or students or women are under attack in Uganda, the LGBT plus community rallies to support them. If we all stand together, united, we are stronger. Unity and solidarity are so important. They're the recipe for every successful movement in history.
Thank you, Peter. So you've been on the front lines for the fight of the LGBTQ human rights for many years. In your documentary, Hating Peter Tatchell, you tackle civil disobedience. How did you find the courage to fight?
Well, first, let me say, when I began my campaigning back in the 1960s in Melbourne, Australia, as I said, there were no LGBT plus organizations, nothing. I didn't know how to do LGBT plus activism, but I had, in my teenage years, been inspired by seeing the nightly TV news bulletins and reading press reports about the Black civil rights movement in America, led by Dr. Martin Luther King. So what I did, I sought to apply his ideals, values, and methods to the struggle for LGBT plus rights. So my ideas about nonviolent direct action and civil disobedience are borrowed from the Black civil rights movement in America. And I've applied those methods to the contemporary struggle for LGBT plus rights. For me, it's really important that we listen and learn from each other. You know, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. There have been decades and centuries of activists before us, and they've shown great courage, but also secured great success. So what I've done is borrow from their successful methods. And to this day, I feel incredibly indebted to the Black civil rights movement in America for teaching me or giving me the information, the ideas about how to do protest and how to challenge those in power who supervise and authorize injustice.
So, Peter, what are some of the lessons you've learned in challenging authoritarian governments throughout your life as an activist?
But of course, when it comes to authoritarian governments, it's much more difficult to challenge compared to a democracy. You know, democracies are not perfect. You know, lots of democracies in the West have, for many decades until quite recently, been guilty of gross persecution of LGBTs, women, Black communities, and many, many others. So the West has not got a blameless record at all. But I think when it comes to now, obviously it's much easier for us in the West to push on LGBT plus rights because we are operating in a democratic space where it's possible to stage protests, to lobby governments, and to put governments under pressure through petitions and write-in campaigns and so on. When it comes to dictatorships, those options are not there. And it is really, really difficult. And I appreciate the obstacles and the hurdles and the risks that people in Uganda are taking to push LGBT plus rights. But you know, even in dictatorship, sometimes there is a space. So I can remember there have been a number of occasions where I have secured dialogue with quite repressive governments, but not dialogue with me alone, dialogue with me and with local activists. Because this isn't about me, this is about the activists in the countries. They know best. It's their struggle, it's their fight. I take the cue from them. And so that's why when I have secured this dialogue, I've always brought on board the local activists, the people on the ground in that country who are fighting the fight. Having said that, of course, that doesn't always work either. But sometimes you do get some people who are open to listening, who perhaps have ill-informed views about LGBT plus people. So that dialogue can sometimes disabuse them of their erroneous views. It can give them factual information rather than propaganda, scapegoating, and stereotyping, which in many cases is all they have ever heard. So I would say that even with authoritarian governments, it's important to dialogue if possible and if it's safe. Now, even in Uganda, I would say that it's probably important to try and dialogue with members of parliament and members of the government. Now, you may get rebuffed, and possibly you've tried that. I know that some people have, and they haven't got very far. But I would encourage people to keep trying because You don't have to do this as an LGBT plus person. You can just do it as a citizen, maybe as a constituent of the member of parliament in Uganda, to seek a meeting with them if you think it's safe. Because I think dialogue at the end of the day is the key. And the sad fact is that many Ugandan parliamentarians have never met an LGBT plus person. They've only known LGBTs through the propaganda that's been fed to them. So to meet an LGBT plus person, or maybe just an LGBT plus ally, if you think it's not safe to identify yourself as LGBT plus, I think that could be progress. But that is up to you to decide. You know the lie of the land better. You know what's safe more than I do.
Talking about the British colonialism as the root of all this, how do
Yeah.
you feel about this obligation, like to be on the front line of this fight for the LGBTQ plus individuals?
Well, one of the reasons why I've devoted so much of my campaigning to supporting LGBT plus people in former British colonies is precisely because Britain imposed these laws on these countries in the 19th century when it was the colonial power. So Britain has left a poisonous legacy of homophobia, not just through the anti-gay laws that were imposed by the British colonial administration, but also the ideology of homophobia that was spread by Christian missionaries from Britain. It's very interesting to note that if you look at the diaries and letters of British colonial administrators, explorers, soldiers, missionaries, and anthropologists, they all say that one of the things that shocked them was the prevalence of homosexuality in and among indigenous peoples, among colonized peoples. And they use that as an argument to justify colonialism. They say in their diaries and notebooks, etc., things like that these people are barbarians. They practice the abominable vice of homosexuality. It's proof that we need to civilize them. And this is why colonization is a good thing. We must colonize these people to Christianize them and to end this vice of homosexuality. So there's a really strong interplay between racism and homophobia. That homophobia was used to justify racism, and racism was justified by reference to homosexuality. There's a great book called The Geography of Perversion by Rudy Bly. Another book, Patterns of Sexual Behavior by Cullen Ford and Frank Beach. And they both document same-sex relations in colonized countries. And in particular, in Rudy Bly's book, how the colonialists used homosexuality, the existence of homosexuality, as a justification for colonization. So clearly, Britain has a major, major responsibility to help shift the dial, to help change things, because we imposed these grotesque laws and this grotesque homophobic ideology. In 2018, at the time of the Commonwealth Summit in Britain, the then Prime Minister, Theresa May, did apologize for imposing those laws. She acknowledged that Britain had been responsible for the export of homophobia, and she said sorry. And that was a very powerful, important decision. The first time any British Prime Minister had ever said that. The problem today, of course, is that Theresa May and subsequent British Prime Ministers can say sorry, but that doesn't change anything. You know, obviously, it's an acknowledgement of a past wrong, and that's good, but doesn't actually change the colonial legacy. It's also important to remember that as much as these laws were imposed by Britain, all these countries are now independent, and most of them repealed a lot of their colonial laws. So when they became independent, they repealed a lot of the laws that had been imposed upon Britain, but not the laws against homosexuality. So although we should acknowledge Britain's responsibility for these colonial era laws against same-sex relations, we also have to say that these countries are now independent and cannot use that as an excuse for continued persecution. It's absolutely clear that these countries are independent. They have their own powers. They could change things if they wished, but they have chosen not to. The other thing to say at this point is, of course, the Commonwealth has a charter. At the moment, there are 29 Commonwealth countries out of 56 that still criminalize same-sex relations, and many of them criminalize both male and female homosexuality. This is clearly against the Commonwealth Charter, which pledges a commitment to equal rights and protection against discrimination for every Commonwealth citizen. Uganda and all other Commonwealth member states have signed the Commonwealth Charter and pledged to uphold it. So the question is, why is the Commonwealth not speaking out against Uganda's failure to honour its pledges under the Commonwealth Charter? We currently have a Secretary General, Baroness Scotland, who has been so weak, so laid back, so indifferent to the plight of LGBT plus people in Uganda and other Commonwealth countries where there is still criminalisation. She should be speaking out like her predecessor, Kamana Sharma, did. Was an Indian diplomat who was Commonwealth Secretary General before Baroness Scotland. He spoke out against homophobic persecution and anti-LGBT plus laws. But Baroness Scotland has almost never done so. And that's an abject failure by her, because she is the guardian of the Commonwealth. She is the person who is supposed to uphold Commonwealth values and ensure compliance by Commonwealth member states.
Thank you, Peter. A simple question. So you're an established activist. I'm asking what have you done? You've been doing a lot, but so far what have you done in creating more space for these young activists across the world who are actually advocating for human rights?
Well, a lot of the time, I publicize the struggles of LGBT plus organizations in countries around the world. So I report on the persecution they face, on their campaigns and struggles. So for many years, I've been working and amplifying sexual minorities Uganda, or over in Ghana, LGBT rights Ghana, or in Jamaica, JFlag, and so on around the world. My role is to help give a voice to LGBT plus activists around the world by publicizing their struggles and their campaigns. And indeed, in a number of cases, I have helped mentor and support individual activists who come to me seeking my help. That's another example. So there's a colleague in Kenya, for example, who started off as a teenage boy in a remote village. He contacted me probably 25 years ago, said he wanted to campaign for LGBT plus rights. He didn't know where to go. So I put him in touch with the Kenyan LGBT plus groups, but he also came back to me time and time again for advice and about how to do campaigning. So I do that as well, but obviously it's very limited because there's only one of me and there's thousands and thousands of activists all over the world. So I haven't, I'm not taking on the whole world. I can't do that. But where I can, I do.
You've been listening to the Debunque It podcast, and I'm Alexa, your host, and this has been our episode 4. Keep listening in, and thank you, Peter, for coming in, and we expect to bring in more.
This is it for the first part of our interview with LGBTQ and human rights activist Peter Tatchell. Thank you, Peter, for taking the time to talk to the Debunque It podcast today. You can hear more of Peter's interview on our 5th episode coming out on October 17th, 2024. Until then, consider donating to Debunque It podcast. Your contributions help us cover guest travel costs, production costs, and keep this important show running. Visit the Debunque It page on royalraceinitiative.org to donate.